During the Great War of 1914 to 1918, combatants harnessed technology and science, along with millions of factory workers and peasants, to fight on a scale never before seen. Generals launched offensives to kill troops and seize territory and to bleed the enemy into surrendering by crippling the economy and starving civilians. The war killed around 10 million soldiers, mostly in Europe but also in the Middle East and Asia, and caused the death of about 7 million civilians who perished from persecution, disease, or starvation. The war led to the overthrow of monarchies in Germany and Austria-Hungary, to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, and to the replacement of the Russian Tsar by a revolutionary communist government. The United States and Japan emerged from the war as major world powers. The U.S. joined the conflict during its final 19 months, from April 1917 through November 1918. American troops suffered 116,000 deaths, 48,000 in combat, and the rest from disease, or about 1.5% of the total military losses in the war. Yet actions taken by the U.S. from the moment the war began affected the outcome of that horrific struggle. Events in Europe also affected America's economy, politics, and social system. Competition for trade and territory sparked an arms race between nations such as Great Britain and Germany, each of whom sought to build dominant land and sea forces. To preserve a precarious balance of power in Europe and other parts of the world, each of these nations forged alliances with the other states. This complex alliance system culminated as Great Britain, France, Russia, Japan, and after the war began, Italy became known as the Allies, and Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey became known as the Central Powers. As each coalition added a partner, the other felt more threatened. Strident nationalism and extreme emphasis on national or ethnic identity made this situation even more unstable. In the Balkans, various Slavic groups such as Serbs and Croats, along with local Muslims, contended for power as the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires lost their grip over the region. Rival nationalism led to several small Balkan wars in the years leading up to the Great War. Some of the worst tension existed between independent Serbia and Austria-Hungary, which controlled Bosnia, a province with a large Serb minority. In June 1914, a teenage Serb named Gavril Princip assassinated the Austrian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, as he visited the city of Sarajevo in Bosnia. When Austria threatened retaliation against Serbia, which supported the terrorist group the Black Hand, to which Princip belonged, Russia pledged to defend its fellow Slavs in Serbia. Germany, which feared Russia's expanding reach in Europe as it industrialized, promptly backed its German-speaking ally, Austria-Hungary. France had already allied itself with Russia to balance the threat it saw from Germany. Concerned that German military and industrial might would overwhelm Europe and threaten its overseas empire, Great Britain supported France and Russia against the threat from Germany. And by August, these rival coalitions mobilized their forces and rushed troops and heavy weapons by train to forward positions. Generals and political leaders convinced themselves that only by going on the offensive and striking first could they achieve a quick and certain victory. Those were beliefs that drove momentum toward war. German military leaders considered war inevitable and took advantage of the crisis to take the offensive against its rivals. Thus, past predictions that world trade and the interconnectedness of modern life made war between advanced nations unthinkable proved mistaken. So were assurances by European socialist and labor leaders that workers would never take up arms against their fellow workers. Capitalists and factory workers, along with conservative and socialist politicians in most of Europe, enthusiastically supported their own national armies. Even the apostle of peace, Norman Angell, decided that fighting Germany was morally justified and called on his British compatriots to, quote, crush the Hun. Even before the outbreak of war, prominent Americans often spoke of an obligation to serve as a model of peaceful capitalist progress. For nearly 2 decades, the U.S. had policed the Western Hemisphere to prevent instability that might provoke European meddling. U.S. investments in Latin American mines, railroads, and plantations were a source of enormous profit. In addition, they were seen as a way to uplift and civilize what were often described as, quote, backward races. To distinguish these actions from that of other imperialist nations, Congress took pride in passage of the two Jones Acts of 1916 and 1917 that conferred partial rights of citizenship on the people of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, which the nation had seized from Spain in 1898. Most Americans interpreted the war in Europe and U.S. detachment as proof of their own good sense in contrast to other people's violent passions. President Woodrow Wilson reacted to the outbreak of fighting by issuing a neutrality declaration that called on Americans to stay neutral in thought as well as in deed. Although Wilson admired Great Britain's democratic system, he considered all the warring nations partly at fault for their greed, competing alliances, and aggressive nationalism. He particularly detested Germany's militaristic stance and its efforts to acquire new territories, which posed a threat to American interest in the Caribbean and Latin America. Americans harbored a wide range of sentiment toward the warring powers. Most wealthy industrialists and bankers traced their heritage to the British Isles. Many elite families had married their daughters to the sons of English aristocrats in a bid to boost their own social standing. As a sign of solidarity and with government approval, major New York banks loaned nearly $2.5 billion, worth about $50 billion in today's dollars, to the British and French during the first 2.5 years of the war. At the other end of the social spectrum, Irish, German, Polish, and Eastern European Jewish immigrants scoffed at the Allies' democratic credentials. For decades, the Irish had fled hunger and oppressive British rule in their homeland. German immigrants who flocked to the U.S. in the 19th century, often in a quest for greater freedom, felt little kinship with Kaiser Wilhelm's strutting militarism, but they resented Allied propaganda depicting their culture and homeland as brutal and savage. The Jews who came in growing numbers to the U.S. after the 1880s had fled anti-Semitic policies of Imperial Russia, which also ruled much of Poland. Nevertheless, President Woodrow Wilson, along with most business leaders, believed that American security and prosperity required maintaining close ties to the British and French. Since the Civil War, the export of grain, cotton, and minerals to Western Europe and British investments in the U.S. had provided the capital to spur economic growth. If the war in Europe stopped exports, the U.S. would suffer immense harm. Factory owners and mill workers, prosperous farmers, and tenant sharecroppers would all be hurt if the war closed down the Atlantic sea lanes. Appealing to both international law and self-interest, Wilson spoke for Americans when he insisted that a neutral U.S. had the right to export non-military goods to all the warring powers and to have its own citizens travel on passenger ships, including those owned by belligerent or warring nations. The country had no right to sell so-called contraband items such as guns or munitions to any of the belligerents, but the president believed it had every right to sell raw materials and non-military products. At the start of the Great War, international law specified that when a naval vessel encountered an unarmed enemy cargo or passenger ship, it should be stopped, boarded, and its crew and passengers offloaded before it was sunk or seized. But the submarine, or U-boat, a new weapon in the German arsenal, was effective only if it attacked without warning. A U-boat that surfaced to identify or board a cargo ship could easily be rammed or sunk by small arms fire. Britain's Royal Navy dominated the Atlantic Ocean from the time the war began. After eliminating German cargo ships, the Royal Navy imposed a blockade against all neutral shipping bound for German-controlled ports in Europe. British warships either turned back or impounded cargo carried by neutral merchant ships, including U.S. vessels attempting to deliver food or raw materials to Germany. This step made it impossible for Germany to import either food or raw materials, some of it bound for civilians as well as for war use, from neutrals like the US. Germany retaliated by declaring the waters around Britain and France a war zone and threatened to attack any ship, allied or neutral, in the area. Wilson condemned British interference with US merchant ships bound for German ports, but since the blockade did not kill Americans or destroy their property, the violations of international law elicited diplomatic protests, not threats of violent retaliation. In contrast, Germany's seemingly indiscriminate use of submarines to attack merchant ships shocked most Americans. In May 1915, a U-boat torpedoed the huge British liner Lusitania en route from New York to England in the Irish Sea. At the time, it was not known that the doomed ship carried in its hold weapons purchased in the U.S. The attack killed 1,200 of 2,000 passengers and crew, including 128 Americans. Newspaper headlines and many public officials condemned the attack as, quote, terrorism. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan showed some sympathy for the German position. He argued that American civilians had no business traveling in a war zone and that selling any products to warring nations was provocative. President Wilson rejected Bryan's reasoning and threatened retaliation unless Germany pledged to stop submarine attacks on all civilian vessels and paid reparations for the sinking. When Germany failed to respond, Wilson sent a stiffer warning. Bryan resigned in protest against what he saw as the president's anti-German belligerence, but Wilson's pressure appeared to pay off. In mid-1915, Germany possessed only about 24 submarines, too few to stop all Atlantic shipping. Rather than risk war with the U.S., the German government agreed to halt most U-boat attacks on merchant and passenger ships. But with an eye to the future, the German Navy accelerated submarine construction. And during 1915 and 1916, U-boats several times attacked British and French passenger ships, some of which caused American deaths. But when Wilson threatened to sever diplomatic relations with Germany, a prelude to a declaration of war by the U.S., Germany again apologized and backed off. Meanwhile, the continued fighting in Europe took a ghastly human and economic toll. To feed, equip, and move their armies, the Allies borrowed millions of dollars from American banks and used the funds to buy vital raw materials. In 1914, the value of goods that Britain and France bought from the U.S. totaled about $754 million. By 1916, the value had more than tripled to $2.75 billion. With this influx of capital, the U.S. displaced Britain as the world's leading creditor nation, a rank the U.S. held until the 1980s. At the same time, because of the British blockade, Germany's transatlantic purchases dwindled from $345 million in 1914 to almost nothing by 1916. Even as U.S. loans flowed to the Allies, American banks loaned almost no money to Germany. Burgeoning trade deepened the connection between American business and political leaders and the Allies. It also enraged German leaders, who saw Wilson as a hypocrite for tacitly accepting the British naval blockade, which harmed civilians as well as soldiers, while condemning German naval warfare as piracy. The Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910 and continued for a decade, posed great challenges to the U.S. Fighting between various armed factions pushed hundreds of thousands of Mexicans into the American Southwest. In 1911, a coalition of Mexicans overthrew the long-serving dictator, Porfirio Diaz, who had welcomed foreign investors into the mining, oil, railroad, and agricultural sectors. His successor, a reformer named Francisco Madero, rattled these investors by questioning the validity of foreign-owned mineral resources and the large land holdings of the Catholic Church. Just as Wilson took office in 1913, one of Diaz's former generals, Victoriano Huerta, seized power, and with what many Mexicans believed was the tacit approval of the U.S. ambassador, murdered Madero. Wilson, in fact, supported the goals of moderate reform in Mexico and was stunned by Madero's murder. He denounced Huerta as a butcher and undertook various efforts to drive him out and bring to power moderate reformers who would stabilize the country and cooperate with the U.S. Wilson's larger goal, he told friends, was to teach the South American republics to elect good men. In April 1914, as part of the effort to force Huerta from power and to prevent a shipment of German weapons from reaching him, Wilson ordered naval forces to occupy the city of Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico. The fighting there killed 126 Mexicans and 19 Americans. A few months later, after Huerta fled Mexico, the path to power opened for Carranza, leader of the Reformist Constitutionalist Party. Although he was pleased to be rid of Huerta, Wilson found Carranza's talk of nationalizing foreign-owned land and mineral rights deeply disturbing, especially if Mexico served as a model for other developing Latin American countries. As a counter to Carranza, Wilson followed the advice of John Reed and backed another contender for power, General Francisco Pancho Villa. In spite of this assistance, Carranza's army defeated Villa and pushed his remaining forces north towards the U.S. border. After Wilson cut off aid to Villa and his men, they retaliated in March 1916 by attacking the town of Columbus, New Mexico, and killing 19 Americans. Villa went on to raid several other border towns between Arizona and Texas. He hoped, it seems, to provoke U.S. retaliation and then gain renewed popular support among Mexicans by resisting the Yankee invaders. Wilson, stung by critics who accused him of failing to defend American soil, dispatched nearly 12,000 troops under the command of General John J. Blackjack Pershing to subdue Villa. During the next 9 months, Pershing futilely chased the bandit general deeper into Mexico. Eventually, American troops clashed with Mexican soldiers sent north by Carranza, who guessed that Pershing's hunt for Villa was actually a pretext to defend foreign oil leases against Mexican plans to nationalize them. German spies in Mexico who witnessed the bungled campaign to catch Villa assured Berlin that American soldiers would be ineffective if they fought in Europe. In July 1916, to avert a wider and unwanted war, Wilson and Carranza agreed to submit grievances to a joint commission. When it convened, Mexican officials demanded that foreign soldiers leave their country immediately. U.S. negotiators retorted that Pershing's troops would stay put until the government in Mexico City guaranteed the safety of foreign investments whose legality had been questioned by the recently drafted Mexican Constitution. Negotiations deadlocked in January 1917, at the same time as Germany decided to resume submarine attacks against American shipping. This new threat in the Atlantic overshadowed tensions with Mexico. Wilson soon withdrew U.S. troops and later extended full diplomatic recognition to Carranza's government. Nevertheless, U.S. relations with Mexico remained sour for the next 20 years. Although American leaders did not realize it at the time, the difficulty the U.S. experienced in trying to shape political development in Haiti and Mexico foreshadowed the much grander challenge that confronted Americans when they set out to reform the world between 1917 and 1919. By the end of 1916, the European conflict had become a total war. Nearly all able-bodied men had been drafted to replenish the ranks of the fallen. Most industrial production went to the war effort, and military commanders overshadowed civilian leaders. In Germany, for example, the military high command, rather than the weak civilian government or even Kaiser Wilhelm, made all the key decisions. The German General Staff feared that the British sea blockade would soon starve both troops and civilians, making it impossible to continue fighting. They hoped, however, that if the Navy unleashed its now expanded submarine force of 120 U-boats against all merchant shipping in the Atlantic, they could starve Britain and France and initiate a win-the-ground war offensive before the United States became much of a military factor in Europe. The plan carried grave risks, but presented the only chance for victory. On January 31st, 1917, Germany informed the U.S. that it intended to order its U-boats to sink any American ships supplying the Allies. As part of their gamble, German strategists hoped to incite war between Mexico and the U.S., and thereby limit the Americans' ability to fight in Europe. In mid-January, as negotiations over the Pershing invasion became deadlocked, German Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs Arthur Zimmermann cabled instructions to the German ambassador in Mexico City. He was to propose to Carranza that if Mexico joined Germany in a war against the United States, a victorious Germany would return to Mexico the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Wisely, the Mexican government shunned the proposal. But British intelligence agents had intercepted the so-called Zimmermann telegram, held it for a month, then passed it to American officials in late February 1917, just as German U-boats were poised to resume their attacks on all shipping. Evidence of Germany's deceit outraged Americans. In Wilson's mind, Germany had become more than an aggressor and violator of neutral rights. It now directly threatened the United States, as well as world peace and democracy. A triumphant Germany, he feared, would dominate not only Europe, but also large parts of the British, French, Dutch, and Belgian empires. The U.S. could not prosper in a German-dominated world. Wilson ordered the arming of American merchant ships and awaited the inevitable U-boat attacks. In late March, German submarines sank 5 American ships, killing dozens of sailors and wounding many more. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war against the German autocracy and militarism that had unleashed what he described as unprovoked attacks on American lives and property. The U.S. would enter the war as an associated power rather than as a formal ally of Britain and France. This status, Wilson explained, would not bind him to honor secret deals made by the Allies to annex territory of the losing side. Most elected representatives, as well as a large majority of Americans, agreed that Germany posed a real threat to the nation. The president's vision of using the war as a tool to improve the world also enjoyed wide support. At home, some politicians, such as Senator Lodge, predicted that a nation unified by war would overcome festering race and class divisions. A few members of Congress, however, questioned the president's judgment. Progressive Republican senators such as Robert La Follette of Wisconsin and George Norris of Nebraska condemned Wilson as a dupe of British imperialism and Wall Street financiers. War, they cautioned, would kill reform at home. In the House, the first woman elected to Congress, Republican Janet Rankin of Montana, opposed the war as immoral. But these dissenters were ridiculed as, quote, treasonous by large majorities of their colleagues. On April 6th, 82 senators voted for war and just 6 against. In the House, the vote was 373 to 50. The federal government worked hard to generate enthusiasm for the war. Wilson appointed the progressive journalist George Creel to head the Committee on Public Information, otherwise known as CPI, an agency tasked with promoting the war at home and abroad as a democratic crusade. Creel and his staff saw their task as, quote, selling the war to consumers, and used innovative marketing methods to accomplish this. CPI provided newspapers and magazines with war information and distributed pamphlets, books, cartoons, posters, billboards, and even films directly to the public. The materials were presented in multiple languages and formats to appeal to recent immigrants and specific subgroups of Americans, such as workers, farmers, adolescents, and so forth. CPI also opened information bureaus in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to communicate directly to millions of people abroad. Creel recruited thousands of Americans to serve as so-called 4-minute men, assigned to give short speeches in support of the war at public gatherings or between the reels of movies. CPI screened pro-war films in nearly all 12,000 American movie theaters. Propaganda posters often portrayed German soldiers as fanged beasts or apes, assaulting women. Others portrayed scantily clad women beckoning boys to join the army and navy. All sides depicted the new recruits as Christian knights galloping into battle. Success in selling the war led Creel and several of his assistants to open advertising agencies during the 1920s. Many leading progressives, such as educator and philosopher John Dewey, journalist Walter Lippmann, women's rights campaigner Carrie Chapman Catt, along with George Creel, became formal or informal employees of wartime federal agencies. The nation's foremost African-American intellectual, NAACP founder and editor of The Crisis, W.E.B. Du Bois, expressed hope that the war overseas for democracy would improve race relations at home. When Treasury Secretary William Gibbs McAdoo announced a series of Liberty Loan bond drives to raise money for the war, women's clubs and labor unions joined the sales effort, which raised about $16 billion of the $24 billion cost of the war. In addition to direct defense expenditures, the U.S. government, supplanting the role of private banks, loaned the Allies $11 billion, more than $200 billion in today's value.
Everyone was now a target. Total war meant even children were involved, as fighting, gas and bombs destroyed their homes. Children were also used in propaganda. Governments had to keep up everyone's morale and keep the soldiers fighting. Propaganda postcards pictured tiny babies carrying guns, showing that everyone was involved and everyone had to play their part.
As the U.S. prepared to send millions of soldiers abroad to protect victims of German aggression, it began restricting many of those same victims from entering the country. The war itself temporarily stopped most transatlantic immigration, but Congress quickly moved to begin the future exclusion of groups now dubbed undesirables. By an overwhelming vote in 1917, it passed the Literacy Act, a law barring the entry of any persons unable to read in their own language on the grounds that this lack demonstrated their ignorance. Other restrictive legislation included the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Trading with the Enemy and Sedition Act of 1918. These laws expanded the definition of treason to prohibit most public and private utterances of words or ideas deemed interference with the war effort. The U.S. Post Office adopted a censorship program that banned delivery of letters, magazines, or newspapers that questioned the justice of the war and the draft or criticized America's allies. The Justice Department and local authorities accused organizations and individuals of subversion if they spoke against the war. Former heroes such as Jane Addams and anti-war representative Jeannette Rankin were ridiculed as, quote, a couple of foolish virgins for questioning the nation's foreign policy. Federal or state authorities arrested more than 2,000 war critics and sentenced 1,200 of them to prison. Among those convicted for criticizing the draft and the, quote, capitalist war that benefited plutocrats and killed workers were Socialist Party and labor union leader Eugene Debs and IWW leader William D. Big Bill Haywood. One measure of the war's popularity was the large voluntary network that assisted the Justice Department. This included 250,000 members of the American Protective League, which had branches in most cities. APL special agents wearing official-looking badges opened mail, wiretapped telephone conversations, and conducted raids against newspapers and bookstores. APL members formed squads looking for slackers, otherwise known as young men who avoided the draft. In one raid in New York City in 1918, APL vigilantes rounded up 50,000 suspects. Raids also took place in Chicago and other cities. State councils of national defense also kept a wary eye out for security threats. They often seized suspicious individuals and interrogated them before notifying regular authorities. In 1919, after the war ended, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the constitutionality of the Espionage Act in the case of Schenck versus U.S. Schenck had been convicted for distributing anti-draft pamphlets and had challenged this as a violation of his free speech rights. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that the Constitution did not protect the, quote, clear and present danger posed by a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic, end quote. Mobilizing the economy for war production proved more challenging than officials had anticipated. In 1917, production for the Allies and for the first phase of domestic rearmament meant that factories already operated near full capacity. The War Department relied on outmoded procurement methods unsuited for modern war. Bottlenecks quickly developed in railroad transportation and shipping. Food, munitions, coal, and other vital supplies were often stuck at depots for weeks while ships waited idly for cargo. To remedy this holdup, the federal government created new regulatory agencies with broad powers over the economy. These included the War Industries Board, the Railroad Administration, the Food Administration, and the Fuel Administration. Many of those chosen to oversee regulatory boards were business executives hired by the government for nominal salaries and dubbed, quote, $1-a-year men, end quote. Just as the citizens groups assisted the Justice Department in rooting out war opponents, private organizations promoted production. Among these was the Women's Land Army. It worked with the Department of Labor to mobilize as farmhands more than 20,000 young, single women, many of them enrolled in college and active in suffrage and other reform movements. Dubbed farmettes, they moved from cities to rural areas where they plowed fields, drove farm equipment, and harvested crops on farms throughout the nation. To mobilize workers in support of the war, Wilson created the National War Labor Policies Board. It drew membership primarily from the ranks of pro-war unions such as the AFL. The board discouraged strikes and pressed workers to forego some benefits in return for pledges of full employment at wages above peacetime levels. This and other groups affiliated with the AFL also established ties with European labor organizations in an effort to build international labor support for the war. Some unions, however, rejected patriotic appeals. Especially in the West, the IWW led strikes in mining towns like Brisbane, Arizona, to demand higher wages. They complained that while large corporations profited hugely from military contracts, workers received only token increases. Local vigilantes, mine guards, and federal agents responded violently. During the summer of 1917, for example, more than 1,000 striking IWW miners were rounded up, placed in railroad boxcars, and abandoned in the New Mexico desert. Most survived the ordeal after being rescued by sympathetic ranchers. The war created special challenges and opportunities for women and African Americans. As 5 million men entered military service and most immigration ceased, paid employment opportunities expanded for women and minorities who had usually been relegated to work in agriculture, service jobs, or as household domestics. However, politically active women had for decades created an array of local, state, and national organizations to promote suffrage. By 1917, 11 states, nearly all in the West, allowed women to vote. Wilson weakly favored women's suffrage, but did not press Congress to pass a constitutional amendment, arguing that the right to vote was a state, not a federal issue. Of course, by insisting that voting rights were a state prerogative, Congress and the president could dodge the controversial problem posed by the many states that barred voting not only by women, but also by most racial minorities. Women's organizations, including the National American Women's Suffrage Association, endorsed the war in the hope that their support would also build national support for voting rights. Nassau leaders pointed out that millions of women had assumed new and vital roles in manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, and government bureaus. Nearly 25,000 women served as army nurses in Europe. Thousands others drove ambulances, staffed canteens for soldiers in the field, or worked as military clerks. More radical suffragists, such as National Women's Party founder Alice Paul, defied bans on demonstrations by staging vigils in front of the White House with signs ridiculing talk of a democratic war in a country that barred half its population from voting. The political wind shifted in favor of suffrage when in 1917 New York State granted women the vote. Finally embarrassed by charges that he had failed to honor his ideals about self-determination, Wilson in 1918 endorsed a suffrage amendment that Congress soon passed and sent to the states for ratification. By August 1920, enough states ratified the 19th Amendment to allow women to vote in that year's presidential election. British suffragists also used the war as a mobilizing tool in the reform campaign, and by 1918, most British women won the right to vote as well. The wartime economic boom, the millions of men who entered military service, and the cessation of transatlantic immigration created labor shortages that pulled African Americans out of the rural South. Around 500,000 blacks quit agricultural work and domestic labor to seek jobs in southern and northern cities, in a diaspora that contemporaries called the Great Migration. Black-oriented newspapers such as the Chicago Defender called this an exodus comparable to the ancient Hebrews fleeing slavery in Egypt. Sharecroppers who made about 50 cents a day left for factory jobs that paid $3 a day. The migrants headed for cities such as Atlanta, Miami, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, and New York. Some were specifically recruited by factory owners as strikebreakers, fueling white working-class hostility to the new arrivals. Racism, along with competition for scarce housing and better-paying jobs, contributed to major outbreaks of violence during and just after the war. Race riots occurred in East St. Louis in 1917, in rural Arkansas in 1919, and in Chicago in 1919. In each of these incidents, dozens of blacks were killed and thousands were left homeless. In the aftermath of the violence in East St. Louis, the NAACP organized a silent protest in which 8,000 black demonstrators in New York marched to the sound of muffled drums, carrying signs that resembled those of the suffragists asking, quote, "Mr. President, why not make America safe for democracy?" End quote. African American leaders and organizations such as Du Bois and the NAACP supported the war, despite Wilson's dismissal of blacks as, quote, "an inferior race." Blacks hoped that the struggle for democracy abroad would spur progress at home. Du Bois urged black Americans to set aside their special grievances and close ranks with white fellow citizens. In the future, Du Bois believed black veterans would become domestic freedom fighters. Wartime service, many black leaders hoped, would promote reforms giving the, quote, "American Negro the right to vote and the right to work and the right to live without insult," end quote. A war for democracy, they believed, would also help people of color around the world. For example, in 1918, Du Bois wrote in The Crisis that, quote, "This war is an end and also a beginning. Never again will darker people around the world occupy just the place they had before," end quote. The war, he predicted, would help create an independent China, self-governing India and Egypt, and an Africa for Africans. The U.S. Army numbered about 200,000 men in April 1917, a tiny fraction of the size of its enemies. Over the next 19 months, however, it grew to over 5 million men. To achieve this extraordinary growth, the government encouraged volunteers and Congress passed a selective service draft that required men aged 18 to 31 to register with local draft boards that determined who would be conscripted and drafted into service. Under the command of General John J. Pershing, the American Expeditionary Force trained, transported to France, and led into battle millions of men dubbed doughboys, drawn from all walks of life. Training camps taught both moral and physical lessons to recruits before they entered the hell of trench warfare. The AEF entered the war at a critical time, just as Germany launched a massive offensive to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Their arrival in France, along with the increased military aid to the Allies that accompanied them, blunted the German onslaught. Americans not only faced death on the battlefield, but suffered the ravages of a little-understood influenza pandemic that killed about as many of them as did enemy bullets. General Pershing insisted that American troops deployed in Europe fight as freestanding units under U.S. command, not as replacements for badly depleted French and British ranks. Pershing made one major exception to this rule, granting the French request to have the 92nd Division of black troops fight alongside their soldiers. Elements of the 92nd Division spent more days in battle than any other American unit in the war. But when French officers presented these brave soldiers with medals, Pershing chastised them for, quote, spoiling the Negroes, end quote. American troops soon encountered hardships that had afflicted other combatants since 1914. Life in the trenches continued to be cold, wet, and horrifying. Food rations often failed to reach frontline soldiers, and they frequently had to drink rainwater collected in shell holes, which spread dysentery. After German mustard gas attacks, many men suffered temporary blindness. Nearly all those in the trenches were covered by lice. The term basket case entered the language in reference to soldiers who had lost limbs and were confined to a basket in a hospital. By the end of the war, about 100,000 American soldiers were admitted to field hospitals suffering from what doctors then called shell shock. The symptoms, already common among British and French troops, including staring eyes or a frozen, terrified look, violent tremors, and cold and sometimes blue extremities. Some victims became blind, hysterical, or paralyzed. Doctors initially thought that high explosive shells rattling the brain caused the condition. The affliction probably resulted, however, from emotional strain caused by long periods in the trenches alternating with intense combat. In Vietnam, in later years, these symptoms are often called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. About half the victims returned to duty after a brief hospitalization, but many remained under care. Symptoms of shell shock sometimes reappeared months or even years later among those who had seemingly recovered. In November 1918, just before the armistice, Republicans won control of both the House and Senate. Thus, any treaty negotiated by Wilson would have to gain substantial Republican backing in the Senate to be ratified by the two-thirds vote. To reach this number, Wilson had to seek at least tacit support from Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Lodge held Wilson in contempt, a sentiment the president reciprocated. Lodge, like Wilson, had a career as an academic author of historical and political treatises, but considered Wilson a sanctimonious idealist and second-rate scholar. Rather than reaching out to Lodge and other rivals, Wilson refused to name any prominent Republicans, or any senators at all, to the peace delegation that he led personally to Europe in December 1918. Before going to Paris, Wilson visited London and Rome, where adoring crowds responded to his calls for negotiating a people's peace. Italian newspapers praised him as the King of Humanity, while British writer and social reformer H.G. Wells called him a political messiah. 32 nations, not including Germany or Communist Russia, attended the peace conference in Paris between January 18th and June 28, 1919. Despite Wilson's promise to negotiate via open diplomacy, American, British, French, Italian, and Japanese delegates did most of the important work behind closed doors, isolated from public scrutiny and with little input from other nations. They concentrated on forging a new map of Europe and dividing the colonial territories of the defeated powers. But to their surprise and irritation, stateless and colonial peoples including Armenians, Africans, Jews, Arabs, Chinese, Koreans, Indians, and Egyptians tried hard to influence the outcome. During the months-long deliberation in Paris, British Prime Minister Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and Italian leader Vittorio Orlando concentrated on carving out spheres of interest in Europe and the Middle East. Orlando, who cared mostly about annexing Austrian territory near the Alps and along the Adriatic coast, left Paris in a huff when he felt that not enough land had been ceded. Lloyd George and Clemenceau insisted on weakening Germany by imposing strict limits on future German armaments, having France occupy some German territory along its border, and imposing a huge reparations bill designed to make Germany pay for wartime destruction. The British and French also insisted that Germany accept as part of the peace treaty a war guilt clause, in which it assumed sole responsibility for the Great War. Wilson, who spent months in Paris and sensed that domestic support for his policies was eroding, had a difficult time resisting these harsh demands. Even though the tone and substance of many decisions made at the conference violated the spirit of his 14 points, Wilson focused his energy on drafting plans for a League of Nations. Since he needed British and French support for this, he hesitated to break with them. Even as he waffled on some principles, Wilson pushed for policies desired by American progressives. For example, he fought successfully to create an International Labor Organization, or ILO, as a League of Nations agency to oversee and coordinate labor policies among member states. Although the president privately acknowledged that the peace treaty drafted in Paris was far from ideal, he believed that once the League began to function, it could modify these imperfect territorial, economic, and political shortcomings. Above all, Wilson insisted that future peace and prosperity required the U.S. and the world's major powers to accept Article 10 of the proposed League's covenant, or charter. This established a system of, quote, collective security that pledged all League members to safeguard the territory and independence of all other members. This system, Wilson argued, would deter future aggression or quickly punish any transgressors. But Wilson had another reason for accommodating wartime allies, like the British, French, and Japanese. He feared the spread of revolution from Russia and wanted quick, cooperative action to stifle the Bolshevik regime. In mid-1918, following Vladimir Lenin's peace deal with Germany that took Russia out of the war, the U.S. and allies had sent troops to northern Russia, ostensibly to keep war supplies stored there out of German hands. But in fact, the foreign armies assisted the Whites, as the anti-communists were known, in what became a brutal 3-year civil war with the Bolsheviks. Wilson sent additional troops to Siberia, where they joined Japanese and European forces in a vain effort to hold the vast region against the communists. Around the time of Germany's surrender, in November 1918, communist groups inspired by the Bolsheviks briefly seized power in Berlin and other German cities, and in Hungary. To counter this threat to Central and Eastern Europe, the Allies provided support to local anti-communist forces who quickly regained power. The concern with halting the spread of communism from Russia contributed to the decision at Paris to create a buffer of anti-communist states, such as Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, out of what had been the western fringe of Tsarist Russia. The victors completed drafting the peace treaty in June, nearly 8 months after the armistice, and presented it to Germany on a non-negotiable basis. On June 28, 1919, with its ports still blockaded, with its economy in ruins, and amid threats of uprisings by left-wing revolutionaries and right-wing militarists, the German government accepted the harsh terms. At a signing ceremony at the old imperial palace outside Paris, Wilson described the treaty, despite his own misgivings, as reflecting, quote, the hand of God. The political and economic climate in the U.S. had changed dramatically by the time the peace treaty came back to Washington for Senate ratification in the summer of 1919. The cancellation of most war contracts triggered a sharp recession. Economic uncertainty coincided with a growing fear of Bolshevism abroad and at home, especially a belief that communist agents, referred to as Reds, either caused or planned to take advantage of labor unrest to seize power. During 1919, major employers cut workers' wages and hours, prompting a nationwide wave of labor unrest. Although the communist movement inside the U.S. was tiny, it was often portrayed as the tip of a Bolshevik lance and held responsible for strikes and acts of violence. In January 1919, unions in Seattle called a general strike that briefly shut down the city. During May and June, several prominent government officials and financiers received bombs in the mail, apparently sent by an anarchist group. Several exploded, killing innocent bystanders rather than their intended targets. These, along with later bombings, convinced many Americans that labor activists and communists were little more than terrorists. In the fall, Boston police officers went on strike, prompting Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge to send in the National Guard as replacements. Coolidge became a national celebrity by declaring, quote, there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime, end quote. In September, more than 300,000 steelworkers walked out when the big mills tried to restore the 12-hour day, 7-day work week, and reduced wages. Industry executives denounced the strikers as revolutionaries and hired many replacement workers, including 30,000 African Americans as strikebreakers. The walkout collapsed in January 1920. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer declared that these events taken together revealed a, quote, blaze of revolution that had engulfed the nation. By dousing the flames, he hoped to win the Democratic presidential nomination in November 1920 and to succeed Wilson. Palmer appointed a young protege, J. Edgar Hoover, to lead the intelligence division within the Justice Department to track radicals. In 1919, Hoover compiled lists of thousands of suspected suspects, many of them immigrants who belonged to groups like the IWW, a newly organized Communist Party. In December, about 250 of these non-citizens were seized and deported to communist-ruled Russia. In January 1920, the Attorney General authorized a broader sweep. The so-called Palmer raids occurred in 33 cities where federal agents without warrants broke into homes and meeting halls to arrest more than 4,000 people on charges of subversion. About 600 people who were seized were deported. Although President Wilson tacitly approved Palmer's harsh methods, the Attorney General overreached. In the spring of 1920, he claimed to have uncovered a, quote, red plot to seize national power on May 1st and deployed troops to protect government buildings and officials. When the day passed peacefully and Palmer could not show evidence that such a plot had actually existed, his credibility and presidential hopes dissolved. However, his young assistant, Hoover, survived the episode. An exceptionally skilled bureaucratic infighter, Hoover stayed on after the Republican sweep in 1920, and in 1924 became director of the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation, later renamed the FBI, a job he held for nearly 50 years. Ironically, an actual terror attack, about which he knew nothing, took place after Palmer's disgrace. On September 16, 1920, an anarchist group exploded a large bomb in front of the offices of J.P. Morgan Company on Wall Street in New York City. The explosion, the deadliest terror incident on American soil until the Oklahoma City bombings of 1995, killed 38 people and wounded 400 others. Like earlier attacks, the victims were mostly working people, not powerful bankers. Instead of promoting revolution, the attack frightened ordinary Americans and contributed to a more conservative drift in national politics. Even before Wilson formally submitted the Versailles Treaty for ratification, 39 senators, more than the one-third needed to defeat it, signed a petition demanding that the League of Nations recognize that the Monroe Doctrine gave the U.S. preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. When the treaty reached the Senate in the summer of 1919, Senator Lodge bitterly criticized it. He argued that Article 10 of the League Covenant, the basis for collective security, unfairly restricted America's freedom of action and might oblige the country to engage in unwise military ventures without congressional approval. During extended public hearings, Lodge introduced many revisions of the text designed to protect Congress's power to make war and to control domestic issues with international ramifications such as immigration, tariffs, and so forth. Other conservative opponents ridiculed the idea that someday an African, Chinese, or Indian representative to the League might sit as an equal to a U.S. delegate. To Wilson's surprise, many progressives voiced doubts about the treaty and League. Senator William Burra, an Idaho Republican, worried that if the U.S. joined the League, it would have to defend British and French colonies or join the Europeans in an anti-communist crusade. Other liberals complained that Wilson had deserted his own principles by imposing a harsh peace on Germany, by allowing Japan to control parts of China, and by ignoring his pledge to spread democracy. Imposing harsh penalties on Germany, they warned, would fuel a desire for revenge, a prediction partly confirmed by Hitler's later rise to power. A few senators criticized the treaty because of some of their constituents objected to specific, often minor territorial adjustments that had moved a village where their grandparents had been born from, for example, Hungary to Czechoslovakia, and they wanted the boundary restored. Wilson dismissed nearly all these criticisms by saying that he had been compelled to make compromises to assure British and French support for the League of Nations. Most of the problems that senators identified could be solved after the treaty had been ratified and once the League of Nations, with the U.S. as a member, began its work. The president opposed any revisions by the Senate because it would open the door to endless changes by other signatories. Wilson began a cross-country speaking tour in September 1919 to bolster popular support for Senate approval of the treaty without changes. He delivered 36 speeches in 3 weeks, often to large and enthusiastic crowds. To reject the treaty and league, he warned, would bring on a new war, and, quote, the very existence of civilization would be in the balance, end quote. On September 26th, at the end of a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, Wilson collapsed. 4 days later, he suffered a nearly fatal stroke that paralyzed his left side. For several months, First Lady Edith Wilson hid the gravity of her husband's condition and acted as his surrogate. After partially recovering, Wilson became even more stubborn. He rejected any compromise with his opponents or supporters. He even insisted that Senate Democrats prove their loyalty by voting against an amended treaty, even if they agreed with the changes. As a result, 3 times between November 1919 and March 1920, the Senate voted down the treaty with and without amendments. Had Wilson allowed Senate Democrats to vote in favor of the amended treaty, it would have likely passed. To end the state of war with Germany and its allies, Congress eventually passed a simple resolution. The rejection of the Versailles Treaty and League membership signified a deep division among American leaders. Some, like Wilson, believed the Great War proved the U.S. must join formally with other nations in managing world trade and enforcing peace. Critics of the League argued that membership would needlessly entangle the U.S. in European conflicts and restrict Americans' freedom to act. Both sides of the debate actually agreed that the nation had global interests and could not isolate itself from world affairs. But they disagreed strongly over how the U.S. should exercise its power and defend its interests, collectively through the League of Nations or unilaterally by picking and choosing issues and nations with whom it would cooperate.
I'm so sad to think that I have had to turn you from your home so cruelly.
I'd be gaining nothing by remaining. What would Mrs. Grundy say? Her conventions, kindly recollect to them. We must please respect to them duly.
But my intrusion needs explaining. I felt my courage waning.
Please, I beg don't mention it. I should not mind a bit, but it has started raining. Oh, the rain from the pits of heaven, and I'd like to be safe in bed. Skies are weeping when the world is sleeping, from the leaving on ahead. It is to remain unshattered and to wait for a clearer sky. As a escaper, we must fly for shelter till the clouds roll by. It